People fish for food, and so do the things in the deep water. Those things fish for you. This is Darkness Prevails, the place to share your scariest true stories with the world. Because this world is a strange one. Personally, I don't really enjoy fishing, but remove the fishing pole from the equation and I'd have a good time, sitting on the shore or the pier, enjoying the quiet or serene view. But whether you're out fishing or just trying to take a nap, sometimes things are the furthest from peaceful as they can be. Enjoy these allegedly true scary fishing stories. If you've ever wanted your story in a video, I'm currently looking for Chuck E. Cheese stories. You can send your story to us with the links in the description. Also, I've got an Instagram now. You can follow me at Darkness Prevails YouTube to catch episodes of my new series of 100-word horror stories. Real quick, here are the first 5 comments from my previous video. The more interesting ones anyway. Carly Cheese says, "Get your game on, Darky." Well, definitely not at GameStop anymore. Joshua Reed says, "Never clicked something so fast." Really? Not even a link on something that rhymes with Warnwub? GFTW says, "I love listening while playing video games. I used to play Disgaea on my PC while watching Step Brothers on repeat, so I feel ya." Forgotten NYC says, concerning the GameStop stories I read, "Giving me $2 for my Wii is my horror story. I can't believe you got that much." And Blue Tag Schoberg says, "I can't even buy games now? Crap. You'll just have to make your own." Now, let's dive into these fishing stories. Number 1. Something's Down There. Submitted by Fat Rabbit 61614. Back when I was young, I used to live near a huge river situated under a gorge. Well, not exactly near. It was technically a street and a field away, but that didn't stop me and my cousins from going there to explore, much to the dismay of our overprotective parents. Especially when I tell you why. This story isn't so much about me, but about my uncle who lived particularly close to the river. He was an outdoorsman, but the one with nature type. You can tell from his tanned, muscular body that this guy has done his fair share of manual labor, and he has the power and skills to prove it. Anyway, his particular hobby was fishing, and not in the traditional boat and reel kind. He and some of his buddies did so by taking the inner tube of what looked like a truck tire and used it as a flotation device. They would lay on top of it while they paddled and dragged a net around. For some reason, this works because, as he said, fish aren't as spooked by what would appear as flotsam to them. Incidentally, this is how he primarily provided for his family. This was the best way he knew how. The river itself was pretty wide, with foot-deep shallow parts that most people can walk straight through to the other side on. The current on these parts weren't very strong, and the sediment was very solid, so you had no real danger of slipping or getting stuck. But other parts were deep as 25 feet, and very murky. These were where the current was strangely powerful. Incidentally, these were the parts that my uncle and his buddies fished at. Now, it won't come as any surprise that some people have drowned in this river. Heck, that's what our parents back then were so afraid of, because we were just small kids near a really dangerous expanse of water. And of course, there were other stories, cautionary tales. One in particular came from my uncle himself, about a child who swam around the deep parts and was suddenly pulled under. Not swept away by the current, not cramps or anything like that, but dragged down. He would play up this story by saying it was a shokoi, a malevolent merman who prowls deep water for people to drown. Of course, only the most impressionable of us kids believed him, until he himself had his own personal story to tell. And he did tell us, hesitantly. This is how his story went. One day, he was fishing with two of his friends, and like always, they were at the deep, murky part of the river. That day, the current was pretty strong, but their inner tubes were anchored on the riverbank, so they weren't particularly getting dragged too far from their spots. But at a certain point, he was beginning to get distanced from the others because his rope anchor was too long. He says that after a while, he felt his inner tube jolt harder than what the current was capable of. He tried to steady himself as best he could, but the more he fidgeted around to balance himself, the more it got more difficult to do so. Then, he suddenly fell off. No, what he told us was that he felt his inner tube was pulled off right from under him, something the current wasn't capable of. Instantly, he was underwater, and while this was nothing new, he was a great swimmer after all. He felt something weighing him down. He couldn't see very well through the murky water, but he swears he saw some dark shadow around his legs, tugging at his ankles, preventing him from kicking up and treading water. The fact that he had little time to draw breath before he went under was not making it any easier. Fortunately, one of his friends saw him go under, and when he saw my uncle thrash about a little, which they said he never does because that would spook the fish, he quickly went closer and yanked my uncle up to the surface level. With the help of his friend, my uncle was able to kick free from the creature that was holding on to him, and they all went back to the riverbank to rest. When asked what happened, all my uncle told his friends was that something had pulled him down, and he had no idea what it was. When my uncle looked at his leg, he saw cut marks on his ankles, like claws that were forced to let go. It was then that they decided that that was enough fishing for one day, and they retreated back to much more solid ground. Needless to say, that story was more than enough to scare me, the more sensible of us kids, into not going to the river, especially when the current was too strong. If someone like my uncle, who practically grew up in the water, nearly lost his life to it, what chance did we have? Of course, that wasn't the end of it, because over the years, we still heard about more people drowning in that river under mysterious circumstances. My uncle still fishes there today, but at his age, he's more than glad to stay on dry land and just use a fishing rod. Even still, he always avoids the spot he almost got dragged under to his doom. "There's something down there," he said, "and I'm not gonna tempt it to try again." Number 2. It Came from the Ocean. Submitted by Andro6657. In 1993, when I was 12 years old, I went fishing with my Uncle Max. He had a fairly big boat with a nice engine. We weren't going out very far though, but I figured we would be gone most of the day. We started early, around 5 in the morning, and drove around in the boat, scanning the coastal area before we finally found a spot to fish. We located a good spot next to an oil platform. It was still a bit dark, but we could see the supplies in the boat without a flashlight or any other lighting, so I figured we were fine. We'd only fished for about 10 minutes when we suddenly heard a bump on the bottom of the boat. It rocked the entire boat. I looked at my uncle, and I shrugged my shoulders. He said, "It's probably a really big turtle." Then he snickered. I laughed. but we were interrupted by a loud and odd-sounding splash. I turned to my right to see the strangest sight I've ever seen. It was a creature, an animal of some kind. It was like a man, but his skin was like that of the old fish, the coelacanth. Brown, scaly skin covered the entire thing. He had white eyes and a gaping mouth. I swear, I even saw fins on him, but it all happened so fast, I can't be sure. It had shot up straight out of the water, about chest high, then sank right back down again. I was so shocked, my heart seemed to stop. In my mind, I thought it had to be a prank or something. It surely couldn't have been a real animal. Still, it was kind of dark, but I swear I saw the shadow of the thing swim off at an unnatural speed under the water, like a dolphin on steroids. My heart was pounding now. In fear and confusion, I looked back at my uncle, but the expression on his face, it scared me even more, because never have I seen my uncle so scared. We both trembled there on the boat, and without a sound, we called it a night and ended our fishing early. Number 3. Don't go fishing at night. Submitted by Levi Logan. This was some years ago. I'm 19, and this took place when I was 11 or 12. I've lived in Florida all my life, born and raised here. I was used to the people, and mostly they were all right, until you meet some of the nighttime ones, that is. And unfortunately for me, that's what happened in my occasion. It was around 7 p.m. one night when my friends asked me if I wanted to go fishing with them in a rather large pond that was across the road from the apartments we lived in. My mother let me, but now that I think of it, that was a horrible decision. After getting all of our fishing gear into a smallish red wagon, we set off across the street. We were making jokes here and there about the gators that supposedly lived in the pond. I'm going to skip some parts because all the fishing was normal. The real creepy part, though, begins when we took the long way home from our fishing trip. It was a very bad idea since the sun had long ago set. I was walking ahead of my two friends, Chris and Tommy. Chris was pulling the wagon with all our fishing stuff in it behind him, while Tommy walked next to him. I turned around to add something to the conversation when I suddenly noticed a black silhouette of a man. They were about 40 feet behind us. I was taken aback, since no one else really walked down this way. It was all grass and fence on either side. I decided to tell them, "Hey, Tommy, Chris, I think someone might be following us." And them being their goofy selves, they didn't believe me at first. They didn't take me seriously. So I kept telling them until they finally looked behind themselves. What I didn't realize was that the silhouette of the man had gotten a lot closer. He was now only about 25 feet away. I could see my friends' faces pale as they noticed the man. Our faces soon turned to fear, as the man suddenly began to run right at us. Right away, I yelled for the others to follow me. I looked behind us, and I'll never forget the man's face. He was in his mid-40s, not very tall but not short either. But what really scared me was the look he had on his face. He was miles beyond angry for some reason I don't know. I turned away. Then we all slipped under a broken part in the fence, and we ran into an unknown neighborhood. We got to the first house we saw and knocked loudly on the door, hoping someone, anyone, would answer our call. Thankfully, quickly, an older man opened the door, and asked us what was going on. After hastily explaining our story, he told us to hide behind his car and that he will find the man who chased us and talk to him. He was only gone for 7 minutes, but it seemed like forever. When he finally returned, he told us that the man saw our wagon and thought we had stolen something. But the gentleman who had helped us claimed that he didn't believe that story, not with the look on the man's face and the strung-out look in his eyes. I don't think we believed him either. We returned home and none of us told our parents. That was probably another stupid idea, but we were afraid of what they would do. We never did go fishing at night again after that. Number 4. Veil End Encounter. Submitted by Lovecraft Dreamer. I live in central New Hampshire. About 10 years ago, I met my now husband. When we were first dating, we went fishing a lot. One evening he said, "Hey, let's go fishing for hornpout. I know just the spot." Hornpout are a night-dwelling fish similar to catfish. I said yes, and we quickly gathered our gear and headed out. We drove for about 40 minutes south to a small town in southern New Hampshire called Wilton. My husband directed me onto a one-lane dirt road. It was very dark on that road. There were no streetlights and no houses around. It was all woods and dirt and just our headlights. We finally made it to the body of water he wanted to fish at, so we disembarked from my truck, then headed out onto the path that goes around the lake, fishing gear in tow. After perhaps 5 minutes of walking in absolute darkness, we made it to a clear spot and began baiting our lures and fidgeting with the glow-in-the-dark bobbers. Suddenly, there was a large-sounding crash in the woods around us. It sounded like a large branch breaking, or a very large wild animal was carelessly thrashing about. We both jumped up and began shining our flashlights in the direction of the noise. We heard another fainter cracking sound come from a different location. Then the woods went silent. No crickets, no other nighttime creatures rustling around, just the random cracking and thrashing sounds. I had goosebumps on the back of my neck. We whispered to each other, trying to figure out what was making the sound as we frantically shone the flashlight around. We were hoping to see eyes reflecting back at us, but instead, we saw nothing. We wondered if it may have been an injured bear or moose. We listened for footfalls, whimpers, and yips from coyotes, but still we heard nothing of the sort. Another loud cracking sound came from our left, followed by a fainter one to the right. There was no wind, no grunting of large animals. We listened in painful silence and came to the conclusion that whatever was out there was no animal, because there were no other sounds to denote footfalls or breathing, unless whatever it was hovering off the ground, which was impossible. The crashing sound was coming from all over at different intervals and at different distances. We both shone our flashlights in the direction of the crashes, from the left and to the right. We looked and listened when there was another even louder, closer cracking, coming from the direction our lights were pointed. That was when we decided to call it quits. We got out of there. My husband is experienced in the woods and has never seen or heard anything like that before. We were both amazed and terrified. Fast forward a few years, and I finally graduated into the age of technology and got my first internet-capable phone. I was researching some local ghost legends and came across the Blue Lady of Wilton, whose headstone rests in the Veil End Cemetery. In one paranormal investigation that I read, the investigators found a body of water behind the cemetery, beyond a small stretch of woods where they found more activity than the cemetery itself. I told this to my husband and showed him the picture of the apparition over the headstone. To my dismay, he said, "Yeah, that's the reservoir where we went fishing at that one night." As soon as the words left his lips, the memory of that evening came flooding back, and we both got chills. A few months ago, I told this story to an online community, and someone pointed out that it could have been a Pukwudgie encounter. I don't know exactly what we encountered that night. Whatever it was, really spooked the both of us. I do believe in the paranormal. I just didn't know how close to the cemetery we were that night. How close we were to the angry supernatural forces that were crashing and breaking things through the woods. And number 5, the pink backpack, submitted by Sui Juris. Every July, I camp with my immediate family in the foothills of southeast Ohio. We are a fairly active family who loves the outdoors and the bewilderment of nature. Surprisingly, the region is beautifully filled with recess caves and scenic gorges. The low, thunderous sound of waterfalls heard deep within the gorge crevices, highlighted by bursts of water bubbles rippling off rocks. The densest of deciduous forests are located here, entering as a gateway to the Appalachians. Ghoulish wind is ever present among the thickets. This particular event took place back in the year 2008. Brood 14 of the cicada season was in full effect, and the never-ending rugged screech produced by thousands of cicadas filled the air. At 7:15 p.m., we had endured the 5-hour car ride there and arrived with about 2 hours of sunlight left. The pop-up trailer was quick to assemble, only expending 15 minutes. Afterward, I asked my mom if I had permission to walk the mile to the fishing dam. Being 14 at the time, my parents put a great deal of trust in my environmental awareness. The previous year, I'd saved my sister from drowning in our pool, and ever since then they thought me responsible. To me, fishing had always come second nature. The simple rhythm of casting and reeling an artificial lure creates a meditative state. I gathered my headlamp and my tackle and began to walk along the roadway in tandem with the cicadas screeching. The whining shrill stitched through the darkening forest. It drowned out the usually faint whisper of families at their campfires. 7:30, I reached the lake and noticed a small pink children's backpack leaning against the trailhead. My only thought was that someone may have left it behind. And unexpectedly, there was no one else around, fishing along the quarter-mile dam. In the past, there were dozens of fishermen in these spots at almost any time of the day, so their absence struck me as odd. At 7:45 p.m., I pushed my way through heavy brush as the tree line practically poured into the lake's bank. I walked halfway along the side of the bank. Pop, pop. My topwater hula popper rippled the surface, luring any stagnant bass to strike. But there was no luck, and I grounded on. Before I knew it, it was 8:55 p.m. The sunset had begun, and the cicadas dramatically calmed to a screech every 5 to 10 seconds. Crack. The sudden sound of branches breaking and leaves crunching came from behind me. Quickly, I spun around, dreading to see a black bear sniffing me out. The approaching sound suddenly halted. A flock of birds quickly flew away from the trees above. The cicadas became eerily silent. I was frozen. Not with fear just yet. Moving too fast in the presence of an unseen bear could motivate it to strike its prey. Crunch. The loudest disturbance came directly from my left. I rotated my eyes, keeping my head completely still. I could not see what caused the sound, so I slowly turned my head to the left. My vision was obscured by the gaining absence of light. I squinted and sighed when a female deer, not 6 feet from me, walked into the remaining light. My muscles loosened, and the moment I wriggled free of my frozen state, the deer ran off. 9:10 p.m. I'd been fishing for a while now, and I was beginning to feel fatigued from the heat. I packed up my rucksack and walked back to the trailhead. The pink backpack was now gone. I figured the owner must have come back for it. Strange, though, because there was very little sign of any human activity. I could not find any human footprints leading up to the backpack from the trail I'd come in from. There was no sign that anyone had been hiking or fishing at that dam for the previous hour and a half. I took my headlamp out and I turned it on. The single beam of light was hardly enough to see 10 feet in front of me. Splash. Just a fish jumping out of water, I thought. I focused the beam on the path leading down the dam, and I scanned across the water. I froze. 15 feet from me, a man dressed in wading johns and a black hoodie was water walking towards me. His eyes lit yellow as the beam pierced him. The pink backpack on his back was open and spewing unknown contents into the water. He froze, adjusting his vision, and stood within 3 feet of water, staring and grinning at me. Crunch. The sound of leaves crunching came once again from behind me. There wasn't one man, but two. Paralyzing fear began to creep into my body. Sweat was starting to drench my skin. The back of my eyes were throbbing. The small screams of dread rang in my ears, and the thumping of my heart cracked the shell of my chest. We both stood in absolute silence before he interjected. "Nice night for lining, yeah?" Lining means fishing. I didn't respond, as anyone nighttime fishing would have a rod and some kind of light source. But he didn't. He took a step toward me as I took a step back. The sneer on his face turned into a crooked smile. He waded 2 more steps toward me and was now within a foot of water. My light flickered off. A perfect moment for the batteries to fade. I panicked and fumbled in my bag for the extra batteries. The light from the moon was my only assurance of the waiting man's position. I dropped my bag and rod as the shadowy figure was now running up on the trail and was within 10 feet of me. Behind me, the final crunching of leaves became my motivation for survival. I took off down the left side of the lake. The two of them reacted to my sudden dash, and the distinct sound of 4 feet closed in from behind me. I hoped I had the advantage, hoped that I was more familiar with the trail, as I'd been down it hundreds of times, and I was fairly short at 5 feet. I ran for 15 minutes straight, the sound of running footsteps diminishing as I outmaneuvered them. At around 9:30, I reached the cul-de-sac and sprinted to our site. My mother was patiently waiting for me, as I had promised to be back 10 minutes before. Behind me, the men were nowhere to be seen. The next morning, I woke up to the scream of my mother at the pop-up door. There, sitting next to the steps into the trailer, was the pink backpack. The pack was covered on the outside with a dried, red substance. There was a strong smell of decay and rotting flesh emanating inside the trailer. My father called the park rangers, and later we were told that inside the bag there was the head of a doe. They suspected that I had stumbled onto some kind of poaching scheme. We left the campground that day. We were only there for a single night out of the planned vacation week, and we haven't been back since. To the jerks that ruined my favorite camping destination, let's never meet again. still planning that fishing trip now, even after hearing of the creeps and monsters and ghosts that lurk near lakes and the best fishing spots? Well, maybe you're fine. Maybe you'll catch that record-setting fish of your life. Or maybe something will catch you and tear you apart limb by limb. Because catching a fish is definitely worth that risk, I guess. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Consider donating just $1 to my Patreon to support this channel and help bring to life future projects such as comics, video games, and more merchandise. Just go to patreon.com/darknessprevails. Thank you for even considering and for listening. Stay safe out there and stay creepy.